In the beginning, there was almost nothing to look at. Not a glamorous headquarters, not a purpose-built industrial palace, not even a proper factory in the way people usually imagine the word. There was a stretch of Dartford Road in Kent, a few converted shops, a founder who sold with the stubbornness of a street trader, and a designer whose damaged hearing kept pushing him toward louder and stranger solutions. Out of that narrow strip of post-war Britain came a sound that would wrap itself around the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Shadows, the Yardbirds, and then almost every guitarist who spent the next 60 years chasing the idea of chime, bloom, compression, and overdrive that somehow felt clean and dangerous at the same time. That sound was not inevitable. It was built by hand. It was built by people who soldered, tested, wrapped wires, bolted speakers into cabinets, glued necks, packed organs, and sent equipment out the door from premises that looked far too modest to be shaping global popular music. It was built in a town that most of the world knew, if it knew it at all, for little more than suburban ordinariness and the road out toward London. It was built by a founder named Tom Jennings, who had more appetite than capital, and by Dick Denny, a guitarist whose own failing ears forced him to imagine a different kind of amplifier. And for a brief, impossible interval in the early and mid-1960s, it worked perfectly. The bands wanted Vox. Television wanted Vox. America wanted Vox. Teenagers who had never heard of Dartford wanted the name on the front grille, and the shape of the cabinet, and the promise that if you plugged into that machine, some part of the future might come through your hands. Then the business decisions arrived. Not one decision, but a chain of them. Expansion capital. A holding company. A distribution deal. A rights deal. A technology shift. A founder pushed aside. A parent company that needed cash for something else. A boardroom view of value that had little interest in the circumstances that had made the value possible. By the time the story is over, Vox still exists, but not in the way the original builders would have recognized. The sound survives. The name survives. The mythology survives. The world that made it does not. Before we go any further, if you care about the lost factories, brands, and sounds that built the modern world, subscribe to Rust and Glory, because these stories only get stranger the deeper you go. This is the story of how Britain's greatest amplifier company was created in improvisation, lifted by the British invasion, divided by licensing, drained by corporate priorities, and turned from a living manufacturing culture into a heritage brand whose most sacred ground is now marked by a blue plaque and, nearby, the everyday commerce of a petrol station forecourt. Tom Jennings was not born looking like the founder of one of the most important names in electric music. He was not the son of an industrial dynasty, not a university-trained engineer, not a financier with patient capital behind him. He was born in 1917, into a Britain where skill and hustle still carried a person farther than pedigree if they were prepared to keep talking, keep selling, and keep improvising. What Jennings possessed early was not scale. It was velocity. He could move from idea to idea, deal to deal, customer to customer with the urgency of someone who understood that waiting politely for the world to recognize your potential is usually another name for failure. Music, for him, did not begin with the electric guitar. It began with accordions, with entertainment, with the practical instruments of ordinary social life. Before Vox became the voice of the British invasion, Jennings was selling, repairing, and talking people into buying accordions in a post-war Britain still trying to rebuild itself. The country that emerged from the Second World War was materially damaged, financially strained, and hungry for pleasure wherever pleasure could be found. Dance halls mattered. Local performance mattered. Portable instruments mattered. Jennings understood this not as an abstract cultural trend, but as a sales environment. He served briefly with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers during the war before leaving on medical grounds. That experience did not turn him into a textbook engineer, but it sharpened the practical habit of understanding how things worked and how they might be repaired, improved, or sold. By the mid-1940s, he was repairing accordions on the side and dealing in second-hand instruments whenever the opportunity appeared. In 1946, he opened his shop at 119 Dartford Road. The often repeated story says he started with a £10 war bond. Whether one prefers the figure for its symbolism or its exact accounting value, the point is the same. This was a company built from tiny beginnings. Jennings sold the way some people campaign. He was relentless, theatrical, cheerful, and opportunistic. The stories about him lingering near schools, waiting for children to come out so he could follow them home and perform an accordion demonstration to their parents sound half comic and half predatory, which is often what aggressive post-war retailing looked like when filtered through memory. But those stories matter because they reveal his core instinct. He did not wait for demand to walk into the shop. He hunted it. The business formalized step by step. By 1949, Jennings' musical instruments existed on paper. By 1950, he had a London showroom on Charing Cross Road, which placed him inside the center of Britain's musical trade rather than at its suburban edge. He was already thinking beyond the small shop model. He wanted product lines, not just transactions. He wanted recurring demand. He wanted a brand. And crucially, he wanted things that were not simply imported and resold. He wanted to make. That impulse first took shape in home organs and early electronic keyboards rather than guitar amplifiers. Jennings's Univox, an electronic keyboard instrument with a built-in valve amplifier, was commercially important not because it created the later Vox mythology by itself, but because it demonstrated two things. First, that Jennings could package and market an electrically amplified instrument under a distinctive name. Second, that he could move from being a dealer and repairman toward being a manufacturer. The shift matters. Repairing and reselling makes you dependent on other people's product vision. Manufacturing, even on a modest scale, lets you own the idea. The business expanded along Dartford Road in the piecemeal way many British firms of the era expanded, not by erecting a sleek new campus, but by taking over whatever premises could be acquired and stitched into functional use. A former estate agent became part of the works. A former fish and chip shop became part of the works. Storage, assembly, testing, offices, and workshops accumulated without the elegance of a master plan. From the outside, it may have looked improvised. In a deeper sense, it was improvised. But post-war Britain made a great deal of world-changing hardware in spaces that looked too small, too tired, or too ordinary for the significance of what went out through their doors. By the mid-1950s, Jennings had a growing business, a habit of constant product pushing, and a restless need for something bigger than accordions and domestic keyboards. The country around him was changing too. Skiffle was spreading. Imported American guitars were scarce and expensive. Amplification was becoming more central to youth music. A new kind of player was emerging, young, louder, less interested in the polite boundaries of dance band sound. Jennings had not yet built the machine that would define his name. But he had built the organizational temperament that would recognize it when it walked through the door. The man who brought that machine through the door was Dick Denny. If Jennings was appetite, Denny was problem-solving under constraint. He was born in 1921 in Erith, only a few miles away, and like many technically minded young men of his generation, he drifted toward electronics less through institutional design than through curiosity, breakage, repair, and repeated experimentation. He was a guitarist, but he was not approaching amplification as a detached engineer optimizing specifications on a clean sheet of paper. He was approaching it as a player who could not hear well enough and needed more out of the equipment than the market was giving him. That detail matters because great audio technologies are often misunderstood after the fact as triumphs of abstract engineering. The Vox story is messier and more human than that. Denny's hearing was impaired, and his injury pushed him toward a demand for presence, clarity, and loudness that would not have felt so urgent to somebody with more ordinary hearing. He did not want a lab instrument. He wanted to hear himself play. During the war years, working at the Vickers factory in Crayford, Denny and Jennings moved within overlapping worlds of wartime industry, local entertainment, and practical electrical knowledge. Friendships formed in shelters, at work, and through performance networks often mattered more in that generation than formal hiring channels. Britain after the war was full of gifted men who had picked up skills in factories, depots, and repair contexts rather than through a polished corporate career ladder. The distance between a munitions plant and a music technology breakthrough may look wide in hindsight, but in the 1940s they were often inhabited by the same hands. Denny's physical health dealt him another blow when he suffered a collapsed lung and lost a lung entirely after surgery in the early 1950s. Again, the clean, heroic version of innovation would suggest that genius transcends bodily weakness. The more truthful story is that weakness often shapes the technical demand itself. Denny's life kept forcing him to work around damage, hearing damage, respiratory damage, the limits of his own body, and that habit of working around limits became part of his design logic. He began building amplifiers for himself, not for a global market. The prototypes that eventually caught Jennings's attention were responses to direct musical frustration. Existing British amplifiers were not giving Denny the sound or the volume he needed. American gear was admired but not easily available. The domestic market was still comparatively underdeveloped. So he built. The earliest forms were rough, functional, and shaped more by electrical ingenuity than by polished product design. But what matters is that the sound they produced was different. When Jennings became aware of one of Denny's prototype amplifiers in 1956, he recognized immediately that he was hearing not just a private solution but a commercial one. Here Jennings's gift and Denny's gift aligned. Denny could make the circuit. Jennings could see the product. The new alliance that formed between them did not erase the tension between maker and salesman. That tension would define much of the company's later history, but at this stage it was exactly what the moment required. Denny joined Jennings and helped turn prototype work into production work. That transition is rarely glamorous. A technically interesting home-built amplifier is not yet a reliable market product. It needs repeatable construction, part supply, cabinets, cosmetic identity, serviceability, and an overall shape that people can recognize on stage and in shops. It is one thing to make one good amplifier for yourself. It is another to build 50, then 100, then several thousand while preserving the quality that made the original special. This is where many brilliant small makers fail. Jennings, for all his flaws, knew how to force a design into commercial life. The company that would become synonymous with Vox was still not fully the Vox people later imagine. It was a hybrid operation: organs, keyboards, retail, repair, amplification, and the gradual accretion of electrical know-how inside cramped premises. Nothing about it was inevitable. But with Jennings pushing for new products and Denny solving increasingly musical problems, the company was now close to the invention that would matter more than everything that had come before it. The first decisive amplifier was not the AC-30. It was the AC-15. That matters because history loves the emblematic object so much that it often forgets the stepping stone that made the emblem possible. The AC-15 was where the essential Vox voice first emerged in a form musicians could feel. Its power rating, cabinet format, and circuitry did not yet make it the amplifier of mass hysteria and arena-scale beat music. But it established the tonal grammar. That grammar rested on a set of design choices that were simple to describe and very difficult to replicate as a whole. Denny wanted responsiveness rather than stiff cleanliness. He wanted upper harmonics that opened instead of flattening. He wanted an amp that sounded alive when pushed, not merely distorted. The absence of global negative feedback in key parts of the design mattered. The use of EL-84 valves mattered. The rectification and the feel of the power section mattered. The cabinet and speaker choices mattered. And because these elements arrived not as abstract theory but through iterative practice, the resulting sound had the kind of organic integration that later imitators often struggled to match. The AC-15 reached the market at a time when British guitar culture was ready for something like it. Imported American amplifiers were scarce, expensive, or both. Domestic competition existed, but the market had not yet been reorganized around a single defining voice. The Shadows, then one of the most influential instrumental groups in Britain, helped change that. Hank Marvin's tone mattered because it was aspirational and reproducible. Not everybody could play like Hank Marvin, but everybody could at least try to buy the amplifier associated with him. The Shadows' early association with Vox was not just useful endorsement. It was market-making. A good product in this era still needed visible public use to acquire myth. Television appearances, tours, and photographs translated circuitry into desire. Players did not buy only what sounded good in theory. They bought what they saw in front of the musicians who seemed to embody the future. Vox was becoming visible. Tom Jennings understood visibility with almost predatory clarity. He may have been conservative in some of his personal tastes, and he sometimes misunderstood where youth music was heading, but he absolutely grasped the commercial value of bands being seen with his products. The same salesman who had once knocked on doors with an accordion now had a far larger stage. Endorsement, placement, access, and relationship building became part of the company's operating system. Still, the AC-15 was not enough. Popular music in Britain was getting louder. Crowds were getting louder. Venues were getting larger. The amplifier that sounded alive in one context could disappear in another. Musicians who depended on clean articulation and usable stage volume could not survive on charm alone. They needed more power. This is where the Vox story becomes legendary because the next step produced not merely a better-selling amplifier but one of the small handful of audio technologies that permanently altered the vocabulary of popular music. Yet the important thing to remember is that the leap from AC-15 to AC-30 did not begin as a boardroom product roadmap. It began as a player complaint. The existing tool, however brilliant, was no longer sufficient to the physical circumstances of performance. And once again, Denny was the man who turned need into form. Before the AC-30 fully arrived, however, the company had already become something unusual. A British maker whose products were no longer just functional equipment but tonal signatures. Musicians were beginning to talk not simply about wattage or utility but about the specific feel of a Vox amplifier. That distinction is everything. Utility can be copied. Signature creates devotion. The AC-30 entered the world because Hank Marvin wanted the AC-15 made effectively twice as loud, and because Dick Denny ignored the first instinctive refusal from Tom Jennings long enough to prove that the idea could work. This is one of those moments in industrial history that only survives because the people involved were stubborn in different directions. Jennings objected because a larger amplifier meant cost, risk, bulk, and the possibility of building something the market would reject. Denny persisted because he was following a musical demand that already existed in front of him. Between them, conflict produced invention. The amplifier that emerged was not just louder. It was physically and tonally distinctive. The AC-30 combined greater output power with the same family of tonal virtues that had made the AC-15 special: treble shimmer, harmonic richness, compression that felt responsive under the fingers, and a kind of vocal top end that later players would spend decades trying to describe. In time, the top boost circuit deepened the identity further, giving the amp an even more recognizable brilliance and control set. But even before that later refinement, the AC-30 had a character that was neither American blackface cleanliness nor the harder, rougher, later Marshall voice. Its importance cannot be reduced to a celebrity list, but the celebrity list still matters. The Shadows helped establish it. Vic Flick's use of a Vox amplifier family sound in the era of the James Bond theme added cultural resonance. Then wave after wave of British musicians made the amplifier visible. It was now not merely a successful product. It was a public sound. The AC-30 also solved a specific historical problem. Britain's early 1960s music scene was still negotiating what amplified live performance ought to sound like. Public address systems were limited, stage monitoring was primitive, venues were poorly adapted, and crowd noise was rising with a kind of sociological violence no engineer had quite planned for. In that context, an amplifier had to do more than reproduce a guitar. It had to project identity across confusion. Vox did that better than most. By the early 1960s, the company was moving from clever manufacturer to defining cultural supplier. That shift changes everything inside a business. Demand becomes harder to satisfy. New artists want access. Existing artists want special treatment. Design pressure increases because each product now enters a symbolic field, not just a retail one. And the gap between what a small hand-built operation can produce and what a cultural phenomenon can consume begins to widen. Tom Jennings's instinct in this period was both enabling and dangerous. He wanted scale badly enough to pursue it, but he was still running a company whose emotional center was personal loyalty, improvisation, and his own will. That can work while a firm is still small. Once international demand begins, it becomes a structural vulnerability. Vox needed to scale without losing the qualities that made it desirable. That is among the hardest transitions in manufacturing history, and it is where many beloved firms break. The AC-30 thus stands at the center of the story for two reasons. First, it is the sonic object that made Vox immortal. Second, it created the very demand profile that later forced the company into partnerships and ownership structures it could not control. The amp was a triumph. The scale crisis it produced was the beginning of the longer tragedy. The Beatles were the biggest name attached to Vox, but they were not the only reason the brand became inseparable from the British invasion. One of the strengths of the company during the early and mid-1960s was that it managed to sit at the crossing point between several related but distinct currents in popular music. The Shadows made the sound respectable and desirable for players who wanted precision and melodic clarity. The Beatles made it globally visible. The Rolling Stones helped place it inside a rougher and more dangerous youth image. The Kinks, the Animals, and the Yardbirds widened the brand's presence across the increasingly fractured and inventive British guitar scene. That breadth mattered commercially. A piece of gear associated with only one artist can become trapped inside imitation. A piece of gear associated with half a generation becomes infrastructure. Vox achieved something close to infrastructure status. If you were a young British guitarist in 1963 or 1964, you did not merely know the name. You encountered it repeatedly in magazines, on stage, in shop windows, on television, and in the conversations of other players. The repetition made the brand feel not optional but central to the era. This is also why later decline felt like such a betrayal to musicians. People were not attached only to the AC-30 as a technical object. They were attached to the sense that Vox was woven into a historical explosion of British creativity. The name sat in the same atmospheric field as Rickenbackers, Ludwig kits, Chelsea boots, televised haircuts, screaming audiences, and the new conviction that Britain could export youth culture rather than merely borrow it. A Vox amplifier was hardware, but it was also a passport into a mood. The visual identity helped. Vox equipment looked like it belonged to the future people wanted. The grill cloth, the script, the cabinet proportions, the organ casing, the unusual guitar shapes, none of it felt accidental. Much of industrial history is shaped by products that worked well enough but never acquired a visual aura. Vox had both. It sounded distinctive and looked distinctive, which meant that every photograph taken of a band on stage quietly served the product. The company was also aggressive about artist relationships. In that respect, it behaved less like a passive manufacturer and more like a culture-making operator. There were arrangements, swaps, trial periods, maintenance favors, priority treatment, and careful efforts to get the right gear into the right hands. This ecosystem of support is easy to overlook if one reduces the history to a few famous instruments. But without it, the accumulation of visible loyalty would have been much weaker. Products do not become myths by engineering alone. They need placement, repetition, and the disciplined construction of familiarity. Meanwhile, Vox's competitors were watching. Marshall's rise later in the decade would change the balance of power decisively, but in the peak beat years Vox enjoyed something rarer than mere market share. It enjoyed symbolic dominance. Competitors could sell amplifiers. Vox was selling the contemporary sound of Britain to Britain itself, and then outward to the world. That dominance did not remove technical criticism or operational strain. Some models overheated. Certain touring needs outpaced what the equipment could comfortably handle. Reliability under increasingly extreme stage conditions was never a trivial matter. The product world of the 1960s was not the sanitized reliability regime musicians sometimes imagine later. Gear failed. Repairs were constant. Modifications happened. Companies chased the needs of artists whose volume requirements were escalating faster than the infrastructure around them. Yet none of that erased the central achievement. If the era had to be given an amplifier voice, Vox had the strongest claim to it. That is why the company's later history cannot be treated as a normal brand management story. When a culturally ordinary product line is bought, licensed, diluted, or shifted abroad, some people notice and most do not. When one of the central sound signatures of a generation is subjected to the same logic, the change is felt as theft. Not legal theft. Historical theft. Something built by specific hands in specific places is carried away behind the cover of routine business necessity, and the new owners inherit the revenues without inheriting the moral weight of what the old work meant. There was another side to Vox's greatness that often gets overshadowed by the AC-30 alone. The company was not merely reacting to the British invasion, it was actively furnishing the stage language of the era. The orange and black Vox Continental organ became one of the most recognizable keyboards in 1960s popular music, not simply because it sounded useful, but because it looked like it belonged in a future-oriented band. Reverse-colored keys, compact portability, immediate stage presence, it offered a visual and practical alternative to the heavier organs that had dominated earlier performance contexts. In the hands of players who needed an instrument that could cut through jangling guitars, it became inseparable from a whole wing of garage, beat, and mod-adjacent music. This matters because it reminds us that Vox's identity was audiovisual from the beginning. Jennings understood display. Denny understood sound. The company's best products tended to fuse the two. They were objects that looked like modern entertainment even before a note was played. That visual fluency is one reason Vox became so televisual. Cameras liked the brand. Audiences could recognize it instantly. The same restless product culture also produced innovations and near-innovations at the edge of what later became standard effects language. Vox's later association with the wah-wah pedal emerged through the American side of the company, especially the Thomas organ engineering context, rather than from pure continuity with the Dartford works. That fact is important, because it shows how the brand's fragmentation also generated things of real significance. History does not sort itself neatly into pure decline after a golden age. Some of the later branches still created essential tools. The problem is that these tools increasingly belonged to a company whose internal unity was gone. One can think of Vox during the mid-1960s as a laboratory whose walls were thinner than people realized. Music was changing so quickly that product cycles were forced to chase live needs, recording needs, stage aesthetics, and export opportunities at once. The AC-50 and AC-100 appeared because players needed more power. Organ ranges expanded because keyboardists needed portability and presence. Guitar lines multiplied because brand ecosystems were becoming commercially powerful. Accessories proliferated because every successful product line attracts an outer ring of ancillary demand. From inside the company, this probably felt like momentum. From outside, looking back, it also looks like a firm taking on a frightening number of moving parts. And still, for a while, the motion generated brilliance. There are manufacturing cultures in which experimentation feels bureaucratic and cautious. Vox in its most alive years was not one of them. It moved like a company convinced that music was opening faster than the market could map, and that the only sensible response was to keep building. That is why the later ownership phases feel so diminished by contrast. The issue was never simply that later firms changed construction methods or cut costs. It was that they inherited a name born in a period of unusually fertile improvisation, and then increasingly handled it with the logic of portfolio management. The result is that when people speak today about the Vox sound, they are often referring not just to amplifier topology but to a larger field of memory. Orange organs, chrome stands, unusual guitar silhouettes, photographs of bands under TV lights, catalogs that looked like invitations into the decade center. The product world was bigger than the AC-30, and that bigger world gave the AC-30 even more symbolic force. It was not standing alone. It was at the center of a whole branded universe that briefly made Dartford Road feel like one of the hidden capitals of modern music. To understand why the later decline feels so personal to musicians and former workers, one has to stop looking only at star photographs and catalog covers and instead walk mentally through the works themselves. Vox was not made in a glamorous industrial complex. It was made in a cluster of adapted spaces along Dartford Road and later in expanded facilities tied to the company's growth. The mythology of the sound can obscure the reality that it emerged from a labor process full of solder, wire, timber, parts delays, subcontracting, youthful ambition, and repeated improvisation. Workers remembered the smell first: warm electronics, solder flux, paint, wood dust, varnish, valve heat. The labor was skilled but not always formalized in the way later quality systems would demand. Hearing mattered. Touch mattered. Fit mattered. Testing was not an abstract certification procedure at the beginning so much as a practical judgment about whether the unit behaved and sounded as it should. In a hand-wired environment, every amplifier retained some trace of the person who built it. That is one of the reasons vintage enthusiasts later turned those early units into objects of reverence. They were not just old. They were made before industrial abstraction smoothed away too much of the human signature. The workforce was young, and that matters too. Many people building these instruments were close enough in age to the musicians using them that the factory floor and the musical world did not feel culturally remote from one another. Young workers wanted to be in bands. Rock musicians visited. Gear moved in and out of the premises. Stories accumulated, lunches shared, artists dropping by, local celebrity rubbing against ordinary work. That porousness gave Vox an energy that no modern compliance-managed brand environment could reproduce. The company also built more than amplifiers. Organs, guitars, effects, microphones, and accessory products expanded the catalog. The Vox Continental organ, in particular, became culturally important in its own right. This mattered commercially, but it also complicated production. Jennings did not run a simple single-product operation. He ran a growing musical hardware firm whose identity was broadening at exactly the moment demand for its most famous amplifier products was exploding. Breadth can look like strength. It can also create management strain. Subcontracting and external supply relationships were part of the system. Cabinet work, speaker supply, transformers, certain mechanical components, and other specialist inputs came from outside firms. This was normal for British manufacturing of the era, especially for firms without huge capital reserves. But it meant that Vox's quality and output were always entangled with a wider industrial ecology. A hand-built amplifier company is never only the hands inside the shop. It is also the reliability of the speaker maker, the transformer supplier, the cabinet shop, the transport schedule, the available premises, and the cash position that lets all of those relationships hold together. Because the cultural afterlife of Vox centers so strongly on the AC30, it is easy to forget how ambitious the broader operation was becoming. The company wanted to be a full musical brand, not a one-amp legend. There were guitars with striking body shapes, organs with unforgettable visual identity, public address systems, bass amplification, and experimental products that reflected the restless instruction Jennings was always giving his designers: find new noises. That restlessness helped generate innovation. It also created managerial overreach. By 1965 and 1966, the company was both visibly triumphant and structurally stretched. That combination is one of the most dangerous states a manufacturing business can enter because external success hides internal strain. Orders and endorsements make outsiders assume that everything is fine. Inside the works, however, the real questions become impossible to avoid. Can we build enough? Can we preserve quality? Can we finance expansion? Can we protect the product in foreign markets? And can the founder remain master of a business that is growing beyond founder scale? At its peak, Vox was producing too many things for the neat legend people now tell about it. That complication is important because it reveals both the ambition and the instability of the company. The popular memory reduces the firm to amplifiers and, above all, to the AC30. The actual business was wider and messier. There were organs, guitars, bass rigs, practice amps, PA systems, pedals, microphones, accessories, and experimental products moving in and out of development. Some were excellent. Some were peculiar. Some were commercially necessary more than artistically essential. The Vox Continental organ is the clearest example. It was not an afterthought in the company's catalog. It became one of the iconic keyboard instruments of the 1960s, immediately recognizable by its color scheme and reverse color keys, and associated with bands that needed a portable, visually striking alternative to heavier organ formats. The same firm that gave guitar culture the AC30 was also helping define the stage aesthetics of keyboard-led beat and garage music. That breadth is a sign of creative energy. It is also a warning sign. Breadth requires coordination, inventory discipline, and production planning. Those are precisely the disciplines under most pressure inside a rapidly expanding company built out of converted premises. The guitars tell a similar story. Vox wanted players to live inside a whole branded environment: guitar, amplifier, organ, stand, speaker column, effects, microphone. In theory, this was brilliant. A musician outfitted in a full Vox rig becomes both customer and advertisement. In practice, it meant that a company already struggling to satisfy amplifier demand was also trying to become a full-spectrum instrument maker. The designs could be bold, even bizarre. Some have become collectible precisely because they look like the future imagined by 1960s Britain. But the manufacturing complexity was real. Inside the works, this breadth produced a workplace culture unlike the heavy industry factory model people often picture in these documentaries. The building was crowded not with one repetitive object moving down a highly stabilized line, but with multiple product families sharing space, labor, attention, and materials. A worker might be near guitar bodies one week, organs another, amplifier cabinets another. The company's youthfulness amplified the instability and the vitality at once. People were learning, making, improvising, and sometimes growing up inside a workplace that itself felt young. One consequence of this environment was that quality depended heavily on tacit skill rather than bureaucratic system. Experienced workers knew how things should look, feel, and sound. That kind of tacit knowledge is one of the great strengths of small-scale manufacturing cultures. It produces craft memory. But it also makes scale harder because you cannot instantly bureaucratize touch, taste, and ear. The more products a firm makes under those conditions, the more it stretches the tacit base on which its quality rests. Tom Jennings's personality reinforced the pattern. He loved novelty. He loved product movement. He loved the energy of a company that seemed to be creating new market possibilities faster than older firms could react. That entrepreneurial hunger helped make Vox extraordinary. Yet hunger can become overextension when every good idea is welcomed without enough structural discrimination. Which products deepen the company's core? Which distract from it? Which can be built well at the required volumes? Which should be left alone? These are hard questions for any founder. They are especially hard for a founder succeeding in real time. By 1966, the public face of Vox was magnificence. Awards, artist associations, export potential, retail heat, and global music visibility. The hidden face was a company stretching every meter of floor space and every ounce of organizational coherence to keep up with what its own success had invited. That hidden face matters because it helps explain why later interventions by larger corporate structures initially looked plausible. Outsiders did not have to invent the bottleneck. The bottleneck was real. Their failure lay in solving it in ways that damaged the living core of the company instead of protecting it. This is also where the mythology of British manufacturing can mislead. We like stories in which small workshops beat larger systems through pure brilliance. Sometimes they do, but only temporarily unless they solve capital, distribution, and process questions without surrendering identity. Vox solved the brilliance part magnificently. It never fully solved the structure part. The most important thing about the summit is that the weakness was already inside it. This is true of more industrial rise and fall stories than people like to admit. Decline often does not begin after the Golden Age. It begins during the Golden Age, hidden by headline success. By the mid-1960s, Vox had almost everything a company could want except the stable structure required to hold onto it. Demand was enormous. The brand was culturally hot. Artists wanted equipment. Distributors wanted product. Retailers wanted supply. But the firm remained capacity constrained and capital constrained. The hand-built processes that made the amplifiers so desirable also made them harder to scale quickly. Success had outrun the physical premises on Dartford Road. This was the strategic environment in which Tom Jennings sold control to Royston Industries. One can understand why he did it. A founder staring at a global wave of demand and limited by premises, capital, and production infrastructure is highly vulnerable to the promise of a larger parent with deeper pockets. In theory, the deal made sense. Royston would provide capital, manufacturing support, and a broader industrial platform. Vox would provide the profits and the cultural electricity. Together, they would turn a fast-growing British maker into a more robust global enterprise. But holding company logic is not the same as founder logic. A founder sees the company as an organism whose future depends on protecting its identity while solving its bottlenecks. A holding company sees a profitable subsidiary as a resource allocation problem. The difference is fatal when the subsidiary's value depends on a fragile combination of craft, reputation, artist trust, and product control. At roughly the same time, the company also pursued a distribution relationship in the United States through the Thomas Organ Company. Again, the logic looked sensible. America was where the scale was. The Beatles had made the demand obvious. A local partner promised reach, logistics, and market capture that JMI alone could not achieve. But here too, what looked like a solution to explosive demand contained the seed of brand dilution. Distribution arrangements are rarely neutral. They decide who controls inventory, service, dealer relationships, pricing pressure, and eventually product interpretation. In hindsight, one can see the perfect storm forming. A small but culturally crucial British manufacturer had accepted a corporate parent and a powerful foreign distribution partner at exactly the moment when its brand identity was most valuable and most vulnerable. The company's future now depended on other people preserving the conditions that had made Vox successful in the first place. That is not a safe dependency. There was also a deeper musical problem emerging. Even if ownership structures had remained ideal, the sound of mid-1960s rock was already changing. Vox's chime and overdrive were central to the beat era, but music does not freeze out of gratitude. By the later 1960s, players wanted more aggression, more stack-like visual force, more raw loudness. Marshall was rising not because Vox had suddenly become poor equipment, but because taste was moving. A company entering ownership turbulence at the same moment the sonic center of gravity is shifting is especially exposed. This is why the next chapters are not best understood as random misfortune. They are the unfolding of a structure that had become too dependent on external entities just as the market, the music, and the production problem were all becoming harder. The summit was real. But it had been built on arrangements that were about to prove ruinous. The American deal is where the story takes on the character of a self-inflicted wound multiplied by corporate impatience. America was not merely another export destination. It was the largest symbolic prize in the global music equipment market. The Beatles had already made that clear. If Vox could have preserved its British product identity while building a robust American supply chain, it might have secured an extraordinary long-term position. Instead, the combination of unmet demand, high import costs, and strategic friction pushed the company toward a solution that split the brand in two. Thomas Organ first made sense as a distributor. A California-based company with established channels could move product into a market that JMI could not easily serve alone. But once JMI failed to keep pace with American appetite, the relationship changed. Distribution frustration became a pretext for production autonomy. In 1965, rights connected to North American manufacture and brand control moved into Thomas Organ's hands for a lump sum deal that looked substantial in the moment and disastrously small in historical perspective. This is where one has to resist the temptation to simplify. Thomas Organ was not a cartoon villain. It was responding to real market frustration and to the economic impracticality of relying on a small British supplier to feed a huge American demand spike. But what was rational for Thomas Organ was corrosive for Vox as a brand. Once American Vox products could be designed and produced independently, the name no longer guaranteed a uniform thing. The consequences were immediate and long-term. American Vox lines increasingly moved toward transistorized, cost-conscious, mass-market designs whose relationship to Dick Denny's original engineering vision was partial at best. Some products have defenders. Some features, including effects innovations associated with the Thomas side, mattered in their own right. But the broader problem remained. The American customer who thought he was buying the same sonic lineage the Beatles had used was often buying a different manufacturing logic under the same badge. That fracture is one of the great, underappreciated tragedies of music hardware history. A brand built on intimate connection between maker, circuit, and cultural moment was separated from the very production identity that had given it power. Once that happens, repair becomes difficult because the market continues to respond to the name while experiencing products of uneven lineage. There is also a psychological cost to this kind of split. Musicians are not simply consumers of specifications. They buy myths, associations, and lineage. When the badge remains stable but the product underneath it begins to drift, trust erodes unevenly and often invisibly. Some players will not know why the equipment feels different. Others will know and begin policing authenticity. Soon the market contains not one Vox but several imagined Voxes, the original British hand-built one, the export fantasy one, the American transistorized one, the catalog one, the artist-endorsed one. From a business perspective, that may seem manageable. From a heritage perspective, it is the beginning of identity damage. The phrase million-dollar mistake survives because the sum looks so small against what was surrendered. In historical industrial terms, the exact figure is less important than the structure of the mistake. Short-term relief in exchange for long-term control of the brand's most explosive market. Once that exchange was made, the future tightened around the company. If the Thomas Organ arrangement fractured Vox geographically, Royston fractured it financially. The holding company had not bought into JMI because it possessed a romantic attachment to guitar amplifiers. It bought into a profitable and culturally hot business that could contribute cash to a broader corporate agenda. The deeper problem, according to later accounts and period reporting, was that Royston needed money for an aviation electronics project often referred to as Midas, a black box or flight data-related system whose development consumed funds and failed to deliver the hoped-for commercial result. For the people who loved Vox because of what came out of the speakers, this sounds almost absurd. The company that helped define the sound of the decade was being treated inside a holding structure as a financing source for a non-musical electronics gamble. Absurd, yes. Unusual, no. This is exactly how conglomerate logic often works. A subsidiary's cultural meaning is irrelevant if its cash flow can be extracted to stabilize or chase some other bet the parent considers strategically important. The effect on JMI was severe. Profits that might have gone into production capacity, quality control, artist support, or product development instead moved outward. Internal rent structures and cross-company financial behavior compounded the pressure. What should have been the company's strongest years became years in which the money generated by musical success was not fully serving musical survival. At the same time, the market was getting harsher. Marshall's louder, more aggressive approach fit the direction of harder late 1960s rock more easily. Vox did experiment and evolve. It did not simply sit still. Solid-state ambitions, hybrid ideas, and new product lines all appeared. But innovation under financial extraction is a different thing from innovation backed by coherent capital. The company was now trying to adapt musically while being weakened structurally. There is a pattern visible here that shows up across British manufacturing history. A firm creates something globally important through local craft and technical intelligence. Scale pressures force it into larger ownership systems. Those systems prioritize balance sheet goals and internal portfolio logic over the fragile conditions that produced the original excellence. By the time the damage becomes visible externally, the decisive internal choices have already been made. In Vox's case, the symbolic violence is heightened by the nature of the product. An amplifier company is not just shipping metal and wire. It is shipping trust. Players need to believe that the machine will work, sound right, and belong to a lineage worth their loyalty. Financial extraction corrodes that lineage even before the public can name the corrosion. Fewer resources for development. More pressure to cheapen. Less room for founder intuition. Greater distance between decision-makers and the product's actual cultural life. By the late 1960s, Royston itself was under strain. The parent that had looked like stability increasingly looked like a trap. And because the trap had been entered at the very moment of Vox's greatest cultural exposure, the later collapse would feel not like a normal business failure, but like the squandering of something the country should have protected better. By the later 1960s, Vox was facing not one future but two, and neither of them was easy. The first future was technological. Transistors, printed boards, modular manufacturing, and the hope that the inefficiencies of hand-wired valve production could be overcome without losing the tonal identity that had made the brand valuable. The second future was musical. Harder bands, louder stages, more aggressive tones, and a youth culture that was moving away from polished beat group brightness toward something rawer and more confrontational. These two futures did not align neatly. A company could misread one while trying to solve the other. Vox experimented with solid-state and hybrid designs not because everyone involved had suddenly become aesthetically faithless, but because the pressures were real. Valve production was expensive. Reliability questions mattered. New technologies always arrive wearing the mask of progress. And if one was sitting in a holding company structure being told to grow, rationalize, and modernize, transistors looked like part of the answer. Yet modernizing an iconic sound brand is perilous because the market rarely wants progress in the same way management does. What musicians had loved about Vox was not simply that it was current. It was that it did something emotionally specific. Once that specificity is weakened, the brand can still sell, but it no longer commands devotion in the same way. Marshall, by contrast, was benefiting from a different alignment. Its louder, more forceful stack imagery and harder-edged sonic identity fit the emerging heavier rock world more naturally. Vox was still trying to translate the grace and brightness of its earlier triumph into a market that increasingly rewarded menace. This does not mean Vox became irrelevant overnight. Far from it. But it does mean that the company's margin for error narrowed precisely when its ownership structure and financial condition made error more likely. A stable founder-led firm with patient capital might have navigated the transition differently. It might have preserved the core amplifier line more carefully while building adjacent lines with clearer strategic discipline. It might have treated transistor products as complements rather than symbolic replacements. It might have accepted smaller scale in exchange for stronger authenticity. But that is not the firm Vox had become. Instead, it was entering one of the most difficult phases a creative manufacturer can face. Being asked to modernize under financial extraction while its core cultural constituency is fragmenting. This is an almost impossible position. If you preserve the old identity too stubbornly, you risk being left behind by taste. If you abandon it too quickly, you lose the believers whose loyalty gave you value in the first place. Vox attempted to move forward, but it did so inside a set of pressures that made nearly every path costly. The later mythology of Marshall as the louder, wilder conqueror and Vox as the chiming, endangered original can oversimplify the moment, but not entirely. something like that shift did happen. The changing sound of rock exposed the vulnerability of a brand whose greatest cultural victory had been tied to the earlier British invasion era. If the corporate side of the story had been stable, that vulnerability might have been survivable. Combined with the corporate side, it became disastrous. That is why one should not separate the aesthetic history from the business history. They are the same story viewed from different angles. The wrong owner at the wrong musical moment can destroy far more than accounting lines. It can interrupt the passage by which a living style evolves without losing itself. Vox did keep evolving, but no longer under conditions that allowed evolution to feel continuous. The result was not simple death. It was discontinuity, the sense, still felt by players and collectors, that the name continued while the inner thread kept breaking and being tied back together by different hands. The dismissal of Tom Jennings in 1967 is one of those moments that would sound melodramatic if it were invented for a screenplay, which is one reason it remains so memorable. The founder had built the company from almost nothing, had driven its growth through hustle and instinct, had helped create one of the most famous sounds in modern music, and now found himself pushed out of the very enterprise that carried his name in all but branding. The immediate pretext often surfaces in anecdotes about unauthorized spending and Jennings's taste for cars. Those details matter only insofar as they show how small incidents become usable when a deeper power struggle has already been lost. The real issue was not a single purchase. It was incompatibility. Jennings was a founder who needed room to dominate his own domain. Royston had no interest in financing founder sovereignty if it interfered with centralized control. Once that conflict matured, his removal became likely. Accounts from people around the company preserved the emotional force of the moment. Jennings, furious and wounded, reportedly spoke of being thrown out by people who did not understand what he had built. That kind of humiliation cuts differently in founder-led firms because the enterprise is rarely experienced as an abstract asset. It is a biography made physical. To lose control of it is to be told that your own creation now belongs to strangers more than it belongs to the imagination that brought it into being. Yet even here Jennings behaved like Jennings. He did not retreat quietly into grievance. He tried to start again. He returned to Dartford Road, reassembled some of the old energy, and attempted another venture with former colleagues. There is something almost painfully British about this second act. Back to improvised premises, back to practical making, back to trying once more with less capital but the same stubbornness. The scale of the old cultural moment could not simply be recreated, but the impulse to build again was still there. Meanwhile, the structure above him continued to collapse. Royston's financial troubles deepened. The parent that had promised scale and support had not only weakened Vox but endangered itself. When the receivership era arrived, it validated the warning built into the earlier decisions. External capital that does not understand the substance of the business can destroy both the subsidiary and itself. JMI's original era was effectively over by 1968. Assets moved. Names changed. Successor arrangements emerged. Catalogs still appeared for a time, because businesses often continue administratively after their real soul has already left. But the old Dartford-centered unity of founder, designer, workforce, and sound had broken. Once that unity was gone, every later iteration of Vox would be working in the shadow of absence. This is also where the emotional grammar of the story changes. Earlier chapters are full of expansion, invention, and proximity. After Jennings's removal, the story becomes one of distance. Decisions happen farther away. Ownership cycles speed up. The brand is handled more as an item than as a lived culture. It does not die at once. That would almost be cleaner. Instead, it begins the slow process of becoming a name that survives its own world. What followed was not resurrection but serial custody. Vox moved through a sequence of owners, restructurings, and revival attempts that kept the name alive while repeatedly thinning the connection between badge and origin. Some later custodians did admirable work. Some made decisions that materially improved products after periods of decline. But the broader pattern is still one of diminishment through transfer. Successor firms kept certain amplifier lines going. Some attempted to preserve hand-wired traditions. Others chased cost savings through printed circuit boards, cabinet changes, cheaper component strategies, or more contemporary market assumptions about what the Vox name could carry. Dallas Arbiter's period has defenders for good reason, not least because the company moved back toward more authentic AC-30 construction and briefly brought Tom Jennings into the orbit again. Later custodians such as Rose Morris helped keep the name from vanishing entirely, but often through compromises that collectors and purists came to view as evidence of degradation rather than stewardship. Then comes Korg, which since the early 1990s has owned the Vox brand and kept it commercially active. Korg's relationship to Vox is one of the great ambiguities of modern musical heritage. On one hand, without Korg the brand might have drifted further into irrelevance or legal fragmentation. On the other, the globalized manufacturing and product strategy of the modern era inevitably place Vox at a vast remove from the labor world of Dartford Road. Heritage survives, but as curated inheritance rather than local industrial life. This is where one must be careful. Heritage brands are not automatically fraudulent. Modern Vox products can be useful, good, and in some cases excellent. The company's official historical storytelling openly celebrates the Beatles, the Shadows, the AC-30, and the crucial moments that made the brand legendary. Contemporary hand-wired lines explicitly market themselves through a studied return to early 1960s design logic. All of that acknowledges a truth. The original achievement still matters because it remains the standard against which every later Vox must be judged. But acknowledgement is not the same as continuity. Continuity would mean the original manufacturing culture, or something recognizably descended from it, still living where it was born. That did not happen. The original works did not become a protected industrial institution the way a nation might preserve a shipyard, foundry, or locomotive works central to its cultural memory. Instead, the company moved through the ordinary brutalities of late 20th century ownership. Better custodians, worse custodians, short-term recoveries, long-term drift. And yet the sound itself proved astonishingly durable. Brian May turned AC-30s into the voice of Queen. The Edge made a vintage AC-30 central to U2's shimmering delay-based architecture. Paul Weller kept the association between mod inheritance and Vox alive. Countless players who had never seen Dartford or met anybody connected to Jennings or Denny still encountered the amp as the physical doorway into a specific kind of British tone. This is one of the strange consolations of industrial culture. Sometimes the product's deepest achievement survives even after the corporate body that generated it has been repeatedly disassembled. Still, survival through repetition is not the same thing as justice to origin. Vox's afterlife teaches a hard lesson. A brand can remain famous while the material world that made it famous is scattered beyond reconstruction. Musicians may continue to worship the sound while the people who first built it disappear from ordinary memory. The market keeps moving. The reverence becomes specialized. Collectors learn serial numbers. Technicians debate circuit eras. Meanwhile, the town where it began lives with a much simpler truth. The work that once happened there does not happen there anymore. There is another reason the Vox story still reaches beyond collectors and amplifier historians. The market itself has spent decades quietly passing judgment on which parts of the lineage were real, which were compromised, and which later efforts came closest to honoring the original achievement. That judgment does not always appear in official histories, but it appears very clearly in what people repair, preserve, pay for, and seek out. Original JMI-era amplifiers command reverence not merely because they are old, but because players and technicians continue to hear in them a particular combination of circuit, cabinet, speaker, and feel that later owners often approximated but rarely reproduced in full. Dallas-era attempts to return to more faithful construction are respected for the same reason. Boutique and replica builders trade on that gap between badge ownership and tonal authenticity. When a market supports painstaking recreations decades after the original factory has vanished, it is saying something deeper than vintage is fashionable. It is saying that the chain of custody failed to preserve what people actually valued. This is why the modern Vox identity contains a productive contradiction. The official brand remains globally recognized and commercially alive. Its own history pages lean proudly into the Beatles, the AC-30, and the British invasion. Modern hand-wired models openly advertise themselves as painstaking reconstructions of early 1960s values. In other words, even the contemporary corporate brand admits that its greatest asset is not simply the present product range but the moral and sonic authority of the Dartford years. The company still needs the original world because the original world is what gave the name meaning. Yet that reliance on heritage cannot fully mask what was lost. A company can recreate a circuit board layout, specify a birch ply cabinet, or source an appropriate speaker. It cannot recreate the exact cultural ecosystem that produced the design in the first place. The scarcity of American imports in 1950s Britain, the collision of beat groups and television, the founder's theatrical sales instinct, the proximity between workers and musicians, the urgency of building louder tools for a country inventing a new pop identity. Those conditions do not come back because a product page uses the word heritage enough times. That is where Rust and Glory's interest lies. The afterlife of a great industrial object is always double. One life continues in the object itself, in the practical use people still find for it, in the sound, feel, or performance that keeps it relevant. The other life continues in memory, commemoration, collecting, and argument. Vox has both. People still use the amps. And people still argue about when Vox stopped being Vox, whether brand survival under new ownership counts as survival at all, and how much responsibility belongs to Royston, Thomas Organ, later cost-cutting owners, changing musical taste, or the unavoidable economics of scaling a craft-driven business. The answer is that the story needs all of those factors. It was not murdered by one decision alone, and that complexity is why the history matters. A simple villain gives emotional satisfaction, but a layered failure gives understanding. Vox was weakened by growth pressure, by licensing, by a holding company's extraction logic, by a changing musical market, by repeated ownership transfer, and by a national industrial culture that too often celebrated invention but failed to stabilize the institutions behind it. Once all of those things combined, the original world became almost impossible to preserve. And yet every time a player, historian, or former worker insists on tracing the line back to Dartford Road, the original company wins a small posthumous victory over the abstractions that consumed it. Because abstractions prefer that we remember the logo and forget the labor. The stubborn work of remembering reverses that. It says, no, the sound came from somewhere. It came from specific hands in a specific town under specific historical pressures. That is what the market, at its best, still remembers better than the owners ever did. That is why the final images matter so much. Not because they are grand, but because they are ordinary. The blue plaque at 119 Dartford Road, unveiled in 2017, does what plaques always do. It compresses a living world into a sentence fit for public memory. From these premises, Tom Jennings and Dick Denny changed the sound of popular music forever. The statement is true, and it is also painfully insufficient. Plaques can identify the site, but they cannot restore the production culture, the traffic through the door, the roughness of the workshops, or the daily labor that made the words on the plaque deserve to exist. Around the site, the geography of ordinary commerce has taken over. This is not scandalous in itself. Cities change. Buildings are repurposed. Retail comes where industry leaves. But when the origin site of one of the most important amplifier histories in the world is bordered by the banal circuitry of daily roadside consumption, the symbolism is difficult to ignore. The transformation from hand-wired sound workshop to service forecourt and convenience retail is almost too neat as a metaphor. A place that once manufactured a cultural voice now sits inside an economy more interested in throughput than making. Then there is the story, half legend, half local memory, that defective or unwanted stock was once buried near the site. One should treat that story carefully. It belongs to oral history and enthusiast testimony more than settled archival proof. But even as a rumor, it reveals something powerful. People want the past still to be physically present under the surface. They want the idea that the old amplifiers are still there somewhere, under the tarmac, not because excavation would make economic sense, but because burial is easier to endure than complete disappearance. If they are under there, then the origin is not fully gone. It is only covered. The modern Vox story continues elsewhere. Corgoned Vox remains active. New players discover the AC-15 and AC-30 through current lines. Official history pages fold the old narrative into the contemporary brand. Premium hand-wired models gesture back toward the craft values of the early 1960s. Boutique and replica makers, including firms trading on the JMI legacy in legally careful ways, serve the hunger for historical correctness. In a narrow product sense, the sound still lives. But what Rust and Glory is interested in is not only whether the sound survives. It is whether the world that produced it was allowed to survive with it. The answer, in this case, is no. Britain produced one of the most influential amplifier cultures on Earth, and let the original company be weakened by ownership arrangements that privileged extraction over preservation. The factory did not vanish because nobody wanted the sound. It vanished because wanting the sound is not enough when the ownership structure no longer respects the conditions of making. This is why the Vox story belongs beside the factory stories, the dead brand stories, and the abandoned work stories rather than only inside guitar nostalgia. It is another example of a country building something world-defining through local skill, and then failing to protect the industrial ecosystem that made it possible. The workers age. The founders die. The designers receive less than the cultural afterlife of their work would suggest they deserved. The name moves on. The sound continues. The place becomes a site of explanation. And still, when an AC-30 opens up under a good player's hands, some part of Dartford comes back. Not the whole place. Not the whole company. Not the solvable version of the story. But enough to remind the listener that industrial history is not dead matter. It is stored in tone, in response, in the way a note blooms and hangs in the air longer than you expect. That is what the sound remembers, even after almost everything else has been sold, split, moved, reissued, and paved over. If one wanted a clean moral, it would be this. Britain built the sound of the 1960s in rooms too small for the significance of what they were producing, and then let accountants, holding companies, and licensing logic separate the name from the conditions that made the name matter. That is true. But it is not the whole truth. The fuller truth is harder. The original Vox world was always fragile. It depended on too few people, too much improvisation, too little capital, too much founder force, too much hand labor for the scale of the cultural wave it caught. The miracle is not that it later broke. The miracle is that it worked long enough to change music at all. A man with an accordion. A damaged hearing guitarist. A few converted shops in Kent. Teenagers soldering and sanding while future legends drifted through the door. Amplifiers built by hand because that was how they had to be built. A sound that reached America before the company had the structure to own America properly. A founder removed from the company he made. A brand that survived in commerce while the original manufacturing life beneath it died. This is not just the history of Vox. It is the history of modern culture's favorite contradiction. The world desperately wants the products of craft, but almost never wants to preserve the institutional conditions of craft once finance discovers the margins elsewhere. And yet the ending is not silence. The ending is resonance. Every time a player chooses that bright, compressed, harmonically blooming voice rather than something cleaner, flatter, or more fashionable, the old argument resumes. Every time somebody stands in front of an AC-30 and hears not nostalgia but possibility, the work of Jennings and Denny comes forward again. Every time a historian, collector, technician, former worker, or obsessive amateur tries to reconstruct what really happened on Dartford Road, the company regains a little of the dignity that boardroom history took from it. The buildings changed. The owners changed. The market changed. The sound did not forget. That is why the story still matters. Because beneath every heritage logo and every commemorative plaque there is a harder question. Who actually made the thing we say we love, and what did we allow to happen to their world once the profits and the fame moved somewhere else? At Vox, the answer is still ringing.